They could have a great session where they learn all of these techniques about how to communicate more effectively with their partner or the importance of date nights. But then when it comes to, actually having to follow through, well, they may be sitting there with their arms crossed pouting because their partner hasn't taken enough initiative to start the date night. And what's really being triggered is some of their own limiting beliefs. Mm-hmm. So they're not following through with their plans in a productive way or an adaptive way at that point.
That's Dr. Lindsay Sewall, and this is The Shift Show. My name is Zac Erickson, and today I'm really excited to present to you one of my favorite episodes of our original run of The Shift Show. This episode was originally titled Limiting Beliefs in Relationships, and it was originally released in July 2019. And when this episode came out, this was a very interesting time because essentially Shift Psych in general made the decision to move away from offering couples counseling from everybody, or from all the psychologists here at Shift. And the reason that we did that, we outlined in this episode, but it's actually, it talks all about how individual issues and individual things that come up for us really show up in the relationship, and it can make it feel like a relationship is the problem when really we've got our own limiting beliefs and our own individual things that we need to work on before we can really conclude whether or not this particular relationship is in trouble, right? And it empowers each individual person to be able to make changes within themselves that may or may not be able to, help improve their relationship. And so Lindsay and I talk all about this. It's a great episode. I think you guys are really going to like it. And without further ado, enjoy.
You're listening to The Shift Show, where we use psychological insight to unravel the craziness of life for you. You growth mindset person, you. Tune in every other Thursday to hear some wacky psychologists demystify what exactly is happening in that weird organ that lives inside your skull. And for this especially delicious podcast experience, we can thank our friends at Shift Psych, the people who deliver a results-driven and innovative approach in therapy land. Throughout the podcast, we'll throw down some serious psych gems, but these are certainly not a replacement for treatment by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So please seek one out if you need help.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of The Shift Show. My name is Zac Erickson, and this is the podcast from the folks here at Shift Psychological, and we've got a really interesting, fun topic today. Joining me today is Dr. Lindsay Sewall from our Calgary location. How's it going, Lindsay?
I'm good. I'm excited to talk about this today. I'm kind of nerding out over here.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic, and it's fun because I feel like this topic is going to be like a really whenever I talk to you, I feel like you have this next level sort of, like, you see the Matrix when we're talking about limiting beliefs in a way that even I don't sometimes, where you like see the code, which I love. And so I'm really interested to get sort of your take on, we talk a lot about limiting beliefs, and so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how limiting beliefs show up in relationships. But I'm really excited about today.
Yeah, thanks. I tend to see therapy as a puzzle, and I'm like trying to figure out the pieces and where they all fit. And so I've obsessed about understanding the little differences between how the different limiting beliefs play out so that I can put the puzzle piece together perfectly. Maybe I'm throwing myself under the bus as a recovering perfectionist, but yeah, so I'm excited to talk about this. I think it will be an interesting opportunity for people to maybe reflect on themselves and see how some of their frustrations with their partner are maybe coming from themselves to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think to start this conversation, and again, we just similar to what we did at this time of recording, we haven't released our recent episode on the lizard brain that Andrea and I did, but we had it be very conversational, and we're gonna kind of be doing that again today. We have a rough outline of what we're going to talk about, but we also are a little bit shooting from the hip. But I do think that what we want to do, and again, by the way, everybody, if you want to contact us, head over to shiftshow.me and head over to the contact page. Let us know how you like these more freeform episodes, because if you like it, then we will do more of this kind of thing. But I wanted to start the conversation with more of like I guess just framing a little bit about like how we approach couples counseling. And like for me specifically, I kind of refer to it. I like to use the analogy of the emotional bank account a lot. Right. Basically, and really just thinking like that your relationship and the state of your relationship is like a bank account. And when you are doing things that bring you closer together and help you feel more love and affection and just like that emotional intimacy is building, those are things that are deposits, and things that drive you further away, whether it's like actual hurtful things that are said or even just stress or conflict. Those things are withdrawals, right? And so there's definitely I actually break the things that we do in therapy often with couples into three areas. There's the good stuff, or the deposits. Let's build the deposits, have more of those. Let's reduce the number of withdrawals, right? Or in other words, how do we manage conflict better? And then the third one is more of like individual issues, right? Like stuff like everybody kind of comes into a relationship with their own baggage, or their own past experiences. And that's what we're talking about today, is that third category.
Yeah, we were joking beforehand. It's almost like it's not you, it's me, or it's not us, it's me.
Yeah.
Kind of part of the therapy.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think I think that, and again, we shouldn't talk so much before we record. I'm noting this now out into the world. But one of the other things that we had said before, right, was just this tendency or this need to actually like reflect when there is like some sort of a conflict or a disagreement or something like that. I think that often a lot of people, we just sort of assume, maybe we don't do this on purpose, but there's just this automatic response of, oh, well, you made me mad, or I don't like this thing you did, or but I think part of like being aware of your own stuff, and your own like why you do what you do is really important. And so totally. Like owning your own side of it, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. I try. I'm definitely not always successful, but I often give examples, for myself. If I'm standing at the door, tapping my foot, waiting because I'm, obsessive about getting places on time, and my husband is less obsessive about that, I could go two ways in that moment. I could get really mad and frustrated and start blaming him for not being on time. Or I can also take a look at myself and go, well, wait a second, like this trait that makes him pretty easygoing is really great in a lot of ways in your relationship. So maybe you feeling irrationally angry that you're going to be 2 minutes late to the farmer's market. Like maybe that's more of a me thing that I need to manage myself and not go after him about it.
But what if all the good asparagus is gone?
Right? Exactly. Right?
Yeah. Right. Which, and I think I like that a lot. And I think that often it's interesting to me how often like people will come in and be like, oh, well, we just are nothing alike. And that's just as if that's a problem. And I think that is a myth that hopefully we can squash a little bit today too, is that in your relationship, it sounds like you're like that is a good thing. Like you complement each other in that way.
Totally. And I say this to couples all the time. Like, so, in a lot of relationships, there's one who's maybe I always give myself like the more neurotic one. And then there's the one who's more kind of easy, like go with the flow.
Yeah.
And that really balances you. Like if there was two neurotics, you would both be amping each other's stress so much. But if there's two super chill people, nothing is ever going to get done. So you kind
Totally.
of need a little bit of both. But it often ends up being those traits that we also can find frustrating because they aren't how we go about doing things. So having your own awareness of what you're bringing to the table can be really helpful in managing some of that.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because I recently, I have this thing and I feel like I use it all the time now. So I have a 3D printer at home that I love to use. And I found this pattern for, it basically is just like little block letters. But if you look at it at a 45-degree angle from one direction, it says black. And then if you turn it and look at, so basically I can just sit it in front of a couple sitting on the couch and be like, okay, what do you see? What does it say? It's like black. Okay, well, what do you see? It says white. And like, okay, now who's right? Which one of you is right? And they're like,
yes.
Right. And they're like, neither of us. We just need to see it from the other person's perspective. Right. And immediately, like the more I use it, the more it's just like it immediately clicks that you're like,
yeah.
Oh, right. Right. And it's like this. I love it because it's a very gentle rebuke. Is what it is.
Yeah, dude,
right?
You should be selling those. That is a great analogy to have in
right.
session.
Yeah. So and so I think part of that too is like realizing, okay, well, just because I see that, and I mean, you can do the same thing with limiting beliefs, right? With like, okay, right now I'm seeing black, but if I see it from a different perspective, then it's white. So I think that part of like what we're talking about today too is like kind of recognizing when you're in a particular situation and there is conflict that's there. I think one of the trickiest things is in sort of moving towards the limiting belief stuff, right? Like I think that there's when we either don't recognize or we become very sensitive to certain kinds of things, maybe like hot button topics, or like, again, like they become limiting beliefs in the relationship. And so then, and they just keep coming up. Right. And often, even when somebody is in session as a couple, and maybe you're doing couples therapy or something, or you're even just trying to work on the relationship, we get snagged on all sorts of different things that really have nothing to do with the relationship at all.
Totally. And that's where, sometimes people out of session or people you're seeing in individual therapy, they'll ask like, hey, should I be in couples therapy right now? And this is where sometimes I think it can be a lot more effective to do the individual work first and then do the couples therapy, because it's kind of like if you're working, sometimes I'll work with young people who are having a lot of issues around procrastination. And that's usually driven by beliefs around like, I'm afraid to fail and I need to do it perfectly and all of that. So we could put a great plan in place for here's all the behavioral things you need to do to not procrastinate. But as soon as they get into the real world and they have to do something, all of those limiting beliefs are going to come up and the plan is going to go out the window. They're not going to follow through. So it's not until we get rid of those limiting beliefs that then they can go and work on the plan.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be like that with couples therapy too, where it's like, they could have a great session where they learn all of these techniques about how to communicate more effectively with their partner or the importance of date nights. But then when it comes to, actually having to follow through, well, they may be sitting there with their arms crossed pouting because their partner hasn't taken enough initiative to start the date night. And what's really being triggered is some of their own limiting beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not following through with their plans in a productive way or an adaptive way at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I think the one area where I don't know if we necessarily disagree, but I guess to complicate it a little bit, because I think I agree with what you're saying, that stuff gets in the way for sure. I think that depending on where, I think that sometimes couples therapy can also be, or I guess it really would depend on how receptive and understanding your partner is, if that makes sense. Right.
Totally.
So if, for example, like you had somebody who is really, very reactive and gets really defensive, and maybe, and we're going to go through some limiting beliefs as well in a minute, but like let's just say it was like fear, like an I'm going to be abandoned, or and maybe like dad left when I was really young, and so I'm very sensitive to rejection or abandonment kinds of things as well, right? But the partner is also very as understanding and as possible, right? I do think that in that kind of a situation, sometimes it can be really helpful, and I think that we need to get to it eventually anyways. Eventually you need to be able to get to a point where your partner knows that about your childhood. And you know what, like maybe for other relationships I've been in, it was okay for me to, like, when things started to get heated, I threw my hands in the air and said, we're not doing this, let's talk about this later, and then leave the house to go for a walk. But if you do that and your partner has that limiting belief of I'm going to be abandoned, you may have just sent them through the roof. And I think that sometimes couples counseling is a good time to be able to explore some of that and sort of help and support one another in working through some of these limiting beliefs and sort of navigating them in the moment as you're kind of, again, as part of the process, I guess.
For sure. Totally. And I think it's kind of one of those, like, you can get to the same end point in a number of ways to get, right? And because absolutely, if you have a partner who can really, hear what that means and adapt to that and all of that, like that's absolutely going to be really healing. Sometimes what we find, we see this quite a bit in Calgary. I don't know if that's the same in Edmonton for you guys, but we'll actually have one person in the relationship starts doing individual therapy with one of us, starts getting rid of some of their limiting beliefs, and then their partner is looking at them going, wait, I want in on that. So then they go to another shift psych and they start doing the individual protocol as well. And then as both of them address their underlying limiters, they don't even need couples therapy because they're not triggered by each other. They're not holding all these resentments. They're not blaming each other. And so instead first they both learn the same language because they're both going through that process. Sure. And then they're able to kind of reconnect to what brought them together in the first place, I guess.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I don't, maybe you guys are just sort of observing it. Again, maybe you're seeing black and we're seeing white, but I totally can see that. That when you say that way, that makes total sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it might be that, you get rid of everyone's limiters, but they still don't know the basic tools for communication, or they still don't know the basic, or not even basic, but there's some pieces that they could just use some tweaking and coaching around. And that's where couples therapy can be really helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Cause I think one of the things that I joke with couples all the time is that like things like the 4 horsemen, for example, that we've talked about in a previous episode, right? Like criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, right? Like those are things, and how to have how to express your needs in a gentle way without coming across as like really harsh. Like these are all things that we should absolutely be teaching people at some point. Like why it's not in the education system is something I will never understand. But I think that, like, if you grew up in a home that was very confrontational, it is going to take time to learn a new way of communicating. And I think that is often a very that is some of the most successful couples sessions that I've had have basically just been me on the sidelines just coaching and saying like, oh, hang on a minute, you're getting defensive again, like, right? And they're like, oh yeah, right, okay. And like they're just almost gaining the confidence, I guess, to communicate through it. But again, if those limiting beliefs are getting in the way and triggering some, again, like getting defensive, or, we're starting to get really frustrated or even scared, right? Like that's a totally different thing. So.
Yeah. Well, because if you grew up in a home like that, where there was lots of defensiveness and criticism and conflict in that way, that's a non-nurturing element.
Oh, absolutely.
So you are right. So you're going to internalize limiting beliefs around that. And then the thing is your limiters don't just show up in your relationship. They show up across the board. So it might be that you can learn how to communicate better in your relationship, but those limiters are still there, and they're causing you to take on a ton of stress outside of your marriage, or relationship, which then also gets brought in, and it's a withdrawal from that bank account, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's why, couples therapy and individual therapy both have their place. But I think often when people are having troubles in their relationships, the tendency is to go, we should go to couples therapy. And it can sometimes be because they want a third person who will take their side.
Yeah.
And, but I think sometimes what isn't there is the education around, maybe individual therapy would be something to consider. And I know we see that when we meet with couples in the initial couple of sessions, where sometimes it's just a little bit of tweaking. Couples therapy can definitely help with that. Other times you might see consistently that, hey, your fear of being rejected is really getting in the way of the work we're trying to do in here. And that might be the opportunity for you to go address that in individual work.
Yeah. Well, okay, so here's a hypothetical situation. Let's talk about this then, because I feel like a lot of times couples therapy as well, and this is me kind of thinking out loud a little bit, but it seems like it might be, I want to say, like, depending on the person, I have people come in where it's like it's safer. I'm not alone in it. I'm not completely vulnerable. I'm not as vulnerable. And especially in a situation where maybe it's easier to blame the other person, it feels like it's like, okay, I can go and blame you. That's fine. Right. But then to come in and say, oh, well, maybe I'm the problem, or maybe, and I think that is maybe where I think that there's some like easing into it is also part of that too. Does that make sense? Like,
Totally. I mean, if I could live life as the option is that everyone else is the problem and not me, I would take that option
totally
first, right? And I think that is, when you're in a relationship that's not fulfilling you, the resentment and the anger and the hurt builds and builds and builds. So it is very tempting to want to go into a couples therapy session to, have this place to duke it out. But, oftentimes, as with everything, it's like, well, I need to kind of figure out what's going on for me. These crash diets that I keep doing aren't working. So if I really want to get healthy, I need to, figure out what my relationship is with food, So it's like kind of getting at that underlying piece. And I mean, I'm just a champion for individual therapy in the sense of, if you get rid of a limiting belief that's impacting your happiness in your dating life, it's also going to impact your
totally
how you feel in every other aspect of your life.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Totally. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Very cool. So okay, so let's go through some of these. So again, like we've said, we have a list of limiting beliefs. You've got a few different like examples too, right? Like I'm interested to like sink our teeth into some of these because I think this is good.
Yeah. So, I mean, the one that always comes to mind first is kind of the I'm not good enough one. That is the umbrella limiting belief that most of us can relate to. And the dysfunctional needs with that are around needing to be perfect. And so that plays out a number of ways in our dating life. We can be very defensive because if my partner tries to tell me that I did something wrong, well, then you're telling me that I'm not perfect, then that must mean I'm not good enough. So now I'm getting defensive because I can't handle hearing any kind of feedback like that isn't just glowing and positive.
Yeah. Like I sometimes when I'm describing this one too, I'll throw out like a few different things of what like the dysfunctional need might be. And one of the ones I say is I cannot make mistakes. Right. And I think that is a big one of like, no, it's not. It's like about needing to be perfect, and maybe subconsciously that doesn't resonate. But like even like, oh, well, you made a mistake or you said something that was hurtful. It's like, no, I can't do that. Like, and again, it's not that we consciously are thinking that. It's more of like, if I feel like I hurt somebody's feelings or that I didn't measure up in some way, maybe, take back the hurt feelings. Maybe that's a different piece, right? But if I didn't do something right, there's like a fear response almost that hits, or like yes, maybe there's anger, but it's like really what we're dealing with is a lot of like shame almost immediately.
Totally. Yeah. I'm like aggressively nodding my head over here. Absolutely. Because you hear a lot of, those fearful moments of, well, I was really stressed yesterday, so I was kind of on edge, and now I'm terrified that my partner's gonna, break up with me, or
Mhm.
I feel so guilty that I, couldn't do X, Y, and Z. That's tied a little bit also to the I'm unworthy one, but yeah, you're terrified that if your partner really sees who you are, they're not going to want to be with you.
Mhm.
But the other twist on it is that we project our dysfunctional needs onto the people that we date.
Oh,
So,
totally.
right? So if I need to be perfect, my partner better well be perfect too. And we might not, again, kind of cognitively be thinking that, but it's happening in the way of we nitpick every little thing that they do. Or if we are in the early stages of dating someone, we might see that, well, they tend to talk with their mouth full at dinner, and I just could never be with someone who talks with their mouth full. So I need to end this relationship. There's no future here,
Yeah.
right?
Totally. Yeah. Well, and I think too that there's a real tendency to where like you said, that there's that like idealizing and holding them to this standard of, and a lot of times how I hear it as well will be like, well, I wouldn't do that. I would never do that. So like, which how do you know? Like, if you were in right, like, is
Yeah.
that actually a real statement? You would probably beat yourself up over it if you did do it. But that doesn't mean you wouldn't do it. And even still, like, that doesn't mean that they have the same reasons or the same perspective. Like, there's so much stuff that gets like just projected onto it. It's like, oh, well, I would never do that, or I can't imagine why somebody would ever do that. It's like, well, I mean, there's lots of people do weird things for all sorts of reasons, and I think being open to that, but again, that feeling of not being good enough and needing to be perfect, again, it just gets in the way, right? It's not realistic.
Yeah. That's an interesting point you make too, about like, or if they did do it that way, they would really beat themselves up. Like, you can understand why people who are perfectionists can also tend to avoid relationships, because the reality is, being in a relationship long term, you are going to disappoint your partner.
Yeah.
You are going to mess up. You are not going to be perfect. And one of the things that we will see is that if you have those cognitions and those dysfunctional needs, you are much more likely to want to be a workaholic, or not want to be, I should say, but you'll be more pulled to workaholism, because at work, there's very clear standards of what you need to do to be exceptional and therefore good enough. Whereas in your relationship, who freaking knows? One day your partner can be happy with you for something, the next minute they're pissed, right? And so because of that, we may not spend enough time with our partner because we're working so much, and then we're so stressed out from all of that work that we come home and take it out on our partner by being irritable or short with them or kind of grouchy and all of that. So, in a bigger system of what their life looks like, it's going to impact the relationship because of that.
Oh, totally. Yeah. That's very real. It's interesting. You said that. Yeah. That being what I distinctly remember being surprised, and I feel like when I say this, there's like a portion of like people that I tell this that are immediately like just jump to assumptions about my wife. And I'm telling you now, like, she's a wonderful person, but she also is not afraid to hold me accountable for my actions, which is one of my favorite things about her, frankly. But one of the things that I said, like, especially after like that first year of being married and like, and that whole process, was like, wow, you know what? I never realized how many flaws I have. Like, I thought I was pretty awesome. And now I realize, and I think that there was a lot of like, I'm not good enough. And like, I did have this certain amount of, I, at the time, at least, maybe even had more of just like this, I don't want to go so far. I as to say that I was narcissistic or anything, but I felt pretty confident, and it, in a good way, it kind of knocked me down a peg and being like, you know what, maybe I'm a little bit more self-centered than I thought I was. And I've got some growing to do. So.
Yeah, well, because one of the factors that goes into having a really fulfilling relationship is that we are putting in intention and effort to meet our partner's needs, right? I could easily just do my own thing and not care about them, but not that you were doing that, but I'm just saying, like, right, in order to
it wasn't malicious, but it was just like naive more than anything.
Right. Totally. Just doing our thing. Right. And so being open to some of that feedback that she's giving you allows you to change your behavior to meet her needs better. But if your I'm not good enough thing was really activated, you wouldn't be able to hear that criticism, right?
Yeah.
You would just get defensive and shut down. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the most important lessons that I learned was how, especially when there is maybe some criticism, and even if it's like heated criticism, right? Or like it's like, no, this is the 10th time I've told you this. What is your problem? Right? The ability to hear and accept that feedback, even though it's like, again, like if there's like a little bit of a limiting belief and it's like, oh, like I'm getting defensive, but I'm going to push through it and hear this. Like for me, that was a big thing, is to not get defensive, because defensiveness it just gets in the way of everything. And like limiting beliefs of like tons of different kinds of limiting beliefs can kind of put us in a defensive stance. So
totally. Yeah, that's so true. I know sometimes I think I've talked about it on here before, but I consider myself a recovering perfectionist. And that's one that I still have to work on when I'm getting, constructive feedback from my husband about something. That my initial reaction is to be like, no, and I want to defend myself, but then I'm like, it's not too late. I can catch it though and be like, okay, let me sit with this for a couple minutes and actually like allow myself to hear what he's saying, so I can come back and, oh, sorry, and yes, you're right, I can work on that. So I think, if you're noticing that you tend to get defensive, it's not hopeless for
totally.
you. You can catch that. But I think another piece that comes in as well along those lines is one of the things another thing, I guess, that you need in a fulfilling relationship is to know exactly who your partner is, good and bad, and be able to accept those things about them.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where this perfectionism thing can be really tricky, because if I want my partner to be this perfect human, it's going to be really hard for me to accept their flaws.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's when you see things like, well, if they could just do this differently, or if they could just do that differently, well, who's to say that they should do that differently?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Well, and I love that, because I think that's, again, I like this because you're convincing me more and more as things go on, right? Which is great. So I think that like that there's no reason. It's interesting. I every once in a while I get a couple who basically, that as time goes on, we have a questionnaire that we give out, and one of the most important questions on that questionnaire for new couples is, and all of them are like, do you completely agree or do you completely disagree? But one of the ones that I key in on very quickly, that I make sure to look at, is the statement of, when we have issues, we discuss them instead of sweeping them under the rug. Because again, like whether we expect perfection out of ourselves or our partner, like either one of those is not a good idea, and like it's just going to get in the way, especially if you're expecting perfection from yourself. It's like I've had some couples come in where really upon investigation, the issue is that they're beating themselves up over it, and they're both doing it, right? And it's like, oh, well, I know that I'm the problem, so I'm not going to say anything. It's like, no. Like, I actually feel like maybe what we need to do is we need to teach you guys how to fight a little bit, or maybe not fight, but we need to learn how to actually, it's okay to complain. It's okay to voice feedback and to give constructive feedback to each other. It's okay to express your needs. And if your partner says something that bothers you or hurts you, it's okay to tell them that was a dick move, right? Like it's okay. That's an important thing to do. Let's just navigate how we're going to say that. So yeah, like I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but yeah.
Yeah. It strikes me that well, it's all on me. Like, I'm the problem. I need to change. I think that's a cocktail of it's my fault, limiting belief, and I'm inferior. Because I'm inferior, it can have the dysfunctional need of I need to be superior. So we like, if we're in a relationship with someone, it can come off as kind of competing with our partner or being excessively jealous when they get, good things handed to them.
And like keeping score and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Or even just like if your partner gets a raise at work or they get a new car that they've worked really hard for, and then you're kind of jealous, like, well, now I need a new car because I need to one up, right?
Yeah.
But the flip side is the dysfunctional need can also be I need to defer to others. So that could be that thing, right? Because it's like, well, what they say is right. I'm the one who's the problem, and they're taking on way more of the blame than they need to be.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right? So and that's where, again, you want to get rid of those beliefs so that they can feel empowered, because if that's showing up in their relationship, then you can bet that they're probably not feeling very empowered in other parts of their life as well.
Yeah, as soon as I sort of notice like that really both sides, especially if it's gotten to the point where they're coming into like couples therapy, if it ever gets to the point where like it seems like it's very one-sided and one person is being painted as the problem, I'm always skeptical of that. And that, I mean, and to be clear, that includes affairs, that includes anything, right? And not necessarily to condone any kind of behavior, but one kind of behavior is always right. Like a lot of times it's, well, maybe there's some emotional distance there, or maybe everybody has a role to play in order to like move things towards making things better. And I think that it's important to own your side of it regardless. And it's important to be able to give that feedback too. And we have this need we need to listen to each other, but we also need to help our partner understand where we're at and what we need. And if we're not doing that, like if we're just sort of like, again, like I don't know if like playing the victim card is necessarily the right word, but just sort of like, again, taking the blame, I think is that it's long term, it's not going to work.
Yeah, so that actually rolls really well into another limiting belief pattern that we see play out a lot in relationships, is the I'm unworthy or I'm worthless one. And it's interesting because I find that this one, a lot of people who are high functioning don't check that off initially. And then when I describe what it looks like, they check it off. Because I'm worthless or I'm unworthy, the dysfunctional need with that is all around I need to provide value or I need to prove my value. So we do that thing where we are hustling for a seat at the table no matter what the table is. And because of that, this is where you see superhuman martyrs, where they're just like, giving. What do you need from me? What do you need from me? Let me say yes to you. Let me take care of you. Let me do everything. And that's problematic for a couple reasons, because without even knowing it, they would be more inclined to choose partners who need saving, because then they can consistently meet their need to provide value.
Yeah.
But then before you know it, you're in a caregiver role, essentially, for a partner. Like maybe it's someone who has an addiction and you want to be the one who can prove to them that they deserve to be loved and they don't need to hurt themselves, or, not standing up for yourself in certain places because you can't ask for what you want in a relationship because your dysfunctional need is all about, no, I'm the one who provides value. I don't ask for it in return. But then another sneaky thing that happens with that one is that person gives and gives and gives and gives and gives, but without realizing it, what they're also doing is they're keeping a tally of all of the things that they've done for their partner.
Yeah.
And then at some point, the explosion happens
Yeah.
where they go, what the hell? I've done all of these things for you and you can't even do this one thing for me, even though I haven't asked you to do it for me because I can't ask because it's really hard for me to, right? So another thing that you need in relationships is reciprocity. But if you're this superhuman who gives everything to everyone, and most likely you probably refuse it when people try to give you help, so then they can't be reciprocal because no one can match that level.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Which is just sort of, it's just this unsustainable, like, and usually it's the kind of thing that just when it snaps, and in my experience too, a lot of times what happens is that by the time we get to that point, we've already built a relationship based on a completely separate set of expectations. And so then we kind of end up doing this thing where maybe they do start to voice it, but it's well, maybe they're a little timid about it first, right? Or it's like that it's like, oh, well, maybe this isn't that great of an idea. Or maybe one of the things that is pretty common, and I've seen this in like several couples, and I think especially, I don't necessarily think that it's impossible to make this work, but a lot of people who, especially in Alberta, there's people who live in Edmonton and then work in like Fort McMurray or something like that, like up in the oil fields, right? And this like, oh, well, this work schedule's fine, right? And then all of a sudden we have kids, and oh, well, I'm still okay with it. It's fine. Like I can hold down the fort while you're gone or whatever. And then over time, there's this like, oh, you know what? Maybe I'm not okay with this. Maybe I never was. And then like even just voicing, maybe this doesn't work. Now we've built a whole life based on this, and dealing with this issue is going to be a big deal to kind of work through that now, right? And so like that not again, like those limiting beliefs early on made us sort of I don't know if settle is the right word, but just sort of accept something that maybe we weren't fully okay with.
Or that we didn't realize that we weren't okay with it until it was, piling and piling and piling and piling. And now we feel like, oh my gosh, I have so much resentment towards my partner because I do the lion's share of whatever it is. And it's interesting. I was talking to some friends who they did premarital counseling and then they had kids, and they were told in the counseling, they're like, before you have kids, you're going to feel like you're both responsible for 50% of the responsibilities in the relationship. When you have kids, you will both feel like you're responsible for 90% of the responsibilities in the relationship, which you can see is breeding ground for resentment as it is.
Oh, absolutely.
But if you have that tendency to go above and beyond and cater to everyone else's needs, what eventually happens is you hear, it's usually a few years down the road, they'll say things like, well, I just want to run away. I just want to run away and go on a beach where there's nobody to ask me for anything, because they can't say no. The guilt of saying no is too strong, because if I say no, then I am not earning my seat at your table.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Absolutely. Well, and I think that a lot of times what's interesting is that when we start to deal with like that, using that example, once you go to some individual therapy and reprocess some of those limiting beliefs and start to get rid of those, what's interesting is that sometimes the reality of the situation is what it is, but like and the outward behavior maybe actually won't even change that much, right? Maybe there's some more like saying no, maybe there's some more of whatever, but there's also sometimes even just this feeling of like, you know what, like this is okay, and I don't resent it anymore because I no longer feel like I'm not important, or that I'm not, right, that I'm inferior, that I need to put everybody else's needs before mine, and therefore like I'm doing this now because my family is important to me and I'm willing to sacrifice for my family, and I actually genuinely feel good about it. Instead of, and I think that that's always the interesting thing, is that a lot of times, this is maybe a little bit of a departure, but I think that sometimes within a limiting belief and dysfunctional need, there's also sometimes like our values that get intertwined with it. I think that like high performance and working hard is like get intertwined with the perfectionism as well, right? And I think that like the doing things for other people and like acts of service that is not the same as having those limiting beliefs. And I think that what we want to do is get rid of the limiting beliefs and leave the value side behind. And that is the only thing then that will be driving you forward, is you're doing it now because you want to and because it's fulfilling, not because there's resentment and this fear or this feeling of like duty and responsibility and like I just have to do it because that's my weight to bear, right? So
Totally. No, that's such a good point because well, in some cases, especially with that unworthy one, if you've been this superhuman that does everything for people, it can really destabilize the dynamic of your relationship when you stop doing that and you start saying no and you start asking for what you need because they're not used to it. But on the flip side, you're exactly right. It might not change a lot, but how you feel inside when you're doing it does, because it's kind of the difference of if I come home at the end of the day and I have a glass of wine with dinner because I'm going to sit there and I'm going to connect with my husband and I'm going to enjoy this glass of wine. That's very different than if I get home at the end of the day and I'm exhausted and I'm burnt out and I'm so stressed with everything that I did that day that I need to have that glass of wine to take the edge off. It's the same behavior, but what is driving it feels very different. So I think the problem with when we're operating based on active limiting beliefs and dysfunctional needs is that we are kind of relying on other people to make us feel whole, to make us feel worthy of love and belonging and all of those things. And I think when you get rid of that, it comes from within. So if somebody else is having a bad day, you don't feel all this internal pressure to make them feel better, or you don't feel resentment that they're not treating you well. Instead, you can show up for them and be like, hey, you seem off. What do you need? Do you need a hug? Are you okay? How are you doing? What was your day like? Like, it's very different because it's no longer a commentary about you.
Yeah, like what, and I love that. That's a great point of just if your partner, that has been a big thing that I sort of shifted on as well. Was when my partner is clearly annoyed or angry, or just like overwhelmed. I think that in the past, and especially like in parts of life where things were really stressful, there's almost this feeling of, oh, not again, right? Or like, oh, what are you like? What, like, don't start, or you know, like just that maybe some stonewalling, defensiveness, that kind of thing. But instead now it's like, okay, hang on a minute, like something's clearly bothering you, and that there's that anger there, but it's like, okay, well, I'm going to lean into this and I want to, like, tell me what's going on. Like, do you need to go lie down? Do you like, what do you need? Like, because I'm here to help and I want to be able to work through this together.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, you're so much more on the same team, right? And,
absolutely.
And you mentioned the one, I'm unimportant. That, to me, that one is the one where we take everything personally, because it's like, or I'm unimportant, I don't matter. Because it's like, well, if I mattered to you, you would have remembered to stop and pick up the dry cleaning like I asked you to. Or if I mattered to you, you wouldn't be being grumpy at me right now. And so every little behavior is a commentary on whether or not I matter to you. And when you get rid of that, then when someone forgets to pick up the dry cleaning, yeah, it's kind of inconvenient and annoying, but it's not commenting on whether or not you're important to them. Yeah,
where every single little mistake is a statement on the state of our relationship and how important I am to you. And yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that one in particular is something. I think the tricky thing, and maybe we could even talk, this is a little bit more of just like off the cuff sort of thing, but I wonder if we had a different list, if like basically just the story about like, and maybe that it's just dressing the same limiting beliefs, but this belief of like, if there are couples or relationship related limiting beliefs that would be more like, well, that's just how our relationship is, right? And the story about our relationship in particular, and the story that we tell ourselves about that relationship, because I think that sometimes it like you just don't care, right? Like it is like, yes, it's just rewording I'm not important, but I think that sometimes it comes out a lot more like we just project it onto the other person, right? Of, oh, well, you don't care.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder, yeah, that sentiment of like, well, it's just what our relationship is. There's some hopelessness and powerlessness in that, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
well, I'm powerless over this anyways, so why bother trying?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I wonder if certain, like, I think too that there are certain, I guess, like traumatic moments within a relationship. Traumatic as in like, emotionally hurtful, and like these feel like a big pivotal moment in our relationship. I wonder if we framed those moments as non-nurturing elements. Like, what is that? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Interesting. That's so interesting. I've never thought about it like that. I think how I would tend to look at something like that is, so say there's a moment where one of the partners cheats.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm in individual therapy and I'm seeing the partner who's been cheated on, what I would look at is, what are you internalizing about what happened?
Mm.
Because that's where you'll hear things like, well, it must have been because I'm just not good enough. Like if I was sexier, if I was in better shape, if I was younger, if I was hotter, if I was like they wouldn't have done that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then they're taking on a lot of that blame. So it's almost like, rather than being a non-nurturing element, I see it as an opportunity to really activate a lot of those limiting beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes, like, in the early stages of a relationship where there's all of this, you're in the honeymoon phase and you're just so excited to be with them, you might not really notice any of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Or even when you're on like vacation together. I mean, sometimes vacations can bring these things up, but, or just when things are generally good, stress level is low in life, things are happy, you might not notice a lot of these limiting beliefs as being problematic. They're still there, but they're at a level that's tolerable.
Mm-hmm.
It's not until life throws a whole bunch of stuff at us that then these things can become really obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, it's even interesting, the point of the affair. One of the ways of looking at that when that happens is, so say you have the belief of I'm not good enough, and then you need to be perfect or exceptional. You're going to end up in a really big pressure cooker in your life, because you need to try harder and you need to be better and you need to pretend that you're always good because you're perfect and no, nothing's ever wrong with me. And you have to, always look like you have your stuff together, and maybe you're working 70 hours a week and all of this pressure, that you need a release from all of that pressure. And that's where we see opt-out behaviors, or like fuck it moments where we're like, well, fuck it, I'm just going to go and seek attention elsewhere. So that might be when an affair happens, right?
Sure,
because
yeah.
I'm too overloaded by all this other stuff. So sometimes even explaining that to a couple of like how it got there could be driven partially by the dynamic between the two of you, but it could also be driven partially by your own stuff that's causing you to be in these big pressure cookers where you need a massive release from, which is, I'm just going to go elsewhere because I don't have the energy to try to rebuild in my relationship to get what I need in that way.
Absolutely. And as you're saying that, I think a good TED Talk that I can recommend for anybody who maybe this is resonating with is her name is Esther Perel. And the TED Talk is Rethinking Infidelity, and she talks all about that kind of stuff that you're talking about.
Interesting. I saw her. I haven't seen that one, but I saw her give a little talk about finding the one and all of this pressure to find the one. And when I was listening to her talk about it, it was making me think of this perfection thing, right? Because it's like, well, I'm expecting this perfect partner who I always feel wanted and loved and happy, and they're my best friend and they're my life partner, and like so many demands on one person. And that made me think of, that's the perfection thing. Like, you're looking for this person who is perfect, just like you expect yourself to be, and that's very unrealistic.
Totally, yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I recently saw a new couple, and often what I'll like in the first session with a new couple, I'll sort of give the sort of set expectations, I guess, a little bit of like, that we're not looking for the perfect relationship. Maybe you have some idea of like what the perfect version of your relationship would be, but that's not what we're aiming for. What we're aiming for is good enough to feel good staying, because newsflash, regardless of the relationship that you're in, you're going to have to put up with somebody's bullshit. You just have to decide, can I put up with yours? That's all you really have to do. And can we get to a place where can we get to a place where I'm okay putting up with your bullshit because you're okay putting up with mine, and together we are growing and we love and maybe even find some of our partner's flaws as endearing, or that we can sort of tease each other about it a little bit, or that we can be sensitive, or that we can be sensitive and understanding and compassionate towards those things. Because I mean, there's, like you said, there is no way that there's going to be perfection in any relationship. I love the I believe it's in Japan, where if they break a dish, have you ever heard of this?
No.
Where in Japan, I believe it's Japan. So listeners, feel free to correct me. But basically, if there's a piece of china that falls and breaks, what they do is that they repair it with gold. Right, with this gold leaf. So it's not something to be, right, like if you were to drop a dish or something here, you'd glue it back together and you want it to look like it was never broken in the first place. But that's not, like, it's much more of, and I love the metaphor of just like, you know what, those imperfections, those flaws, those are what make things interesting. And that's actually what makes you like a one of a kind person, because those are like, that can be something that is beautiful and celebrated, and like that's where that brings so much richness and flavor to the relationship, is just appreciating your partner for who they are, and that we don't need to hold up any sort of like this standard of perfection, because it's just not, frankly, I think it's boring. It would be boring if they like, oh yeah, my partner is, they're just totally, they're great, there's no problems, there's no it would end up being totally predictable. So
totally. I love that about the plate. That's hilarious. Actually, when I got married, one of our family friends had hand painted this beautiful plate, decorative plate for us, and it broke on transportation, and she super glued it back together and felt so bad. But we had just finished reading Brene Brown's Gifts of Imperfection, and we're like, no, this represents that our marriage won't be perfect, but that it can still be whole and beautiful and all this. But I think the other thing to what you're saying, I totally agree with it. And I think sometimes it might not even be being able to just accept and tolerate your partner's imperfections, but what you are perceiving as a flaw might actually not be a flaw. It might be something you could learn from, because every quote unquote bad trait has an opposite good to it, right? Mm-hmm. So like I remember early on when I was dating my now husband, and I was like full blown, I was on residency, and my perfectionism was like out of control. I was like a perfectionism monster. And my husband's very easygoing and he's chill and all this. And I remember sometimes I'd be getting frustrated, like, why isn't he more concerned about this? Or why isn't he worried about getting here on time? Or why is he whatever? And then at one point I stopped and I was like, wait a second. Which one of us is more stressed out right now? The one who's obsessing about doing this perfectly, or the one who's like, you know what, if we're 5 minutes late, it just doesn't matter. And I think in that moment, it was a big realization for me that, the thing that makes him late sometimes is also the thing that makes him way less stressed than I am. So I can't be on my high horse judging him for not worrying about being late when I can actually be learning from him. Mm-hmm. If I can put my own ego aside.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's funny because I feel like I was absolutely. Would it be fair to say? So let me ask you this: do you find that over time your husband has been, and maybe I shouldn't ask this because I shouldn't assume, but I would assume that your husband over time has maybe become a little bit more conscientious as well.
Totally. Yeah. I would say that we would both tell. I think if he was here, we would both agree that we've both learned from each other, right? Like he's maybe a little bit more motivated in certain areas that he wouldn't have been before. And I'm maybe learning to just like, whatever, it doesn't matter so much about this, that, and whatever it might be. So yeah, exactly. And I think if and I don't nail it all the time. He would tell you there's still many days where I'm sitting at the doorway impatiently being like, right? But, you catch it sometimes. And I think the more you can catch it, the better that's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, that's awesome. No, that is exactly the same situation with my wife and I too, where it's just that over time. It's funny when you start to change roles, but like I don't know if that's ever happened, where like
Yes.
I'm the one who's like, hey, what's going on, and she's the one telling me to chill out. Then I'm like, oh, okay, wow, like this I never would have expected this to happen. Like we
Yeah.
have learned from each other a lot now, so
Totally.
which is great. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so true. And I think like one of the things that we're talking about kind of around all of this is the limiting beliefs around control and powerlessness.
mhm.
Because if you feel not in control, then anytime things aren't going the way that you want them to be, or when you don't have a sense of certainty, then you're going to feel quite anxious and then you're going to want to try to control things. So it may be that you find, say, you've been at a particularly bad day at work where nothing was going the way that you want it to be. Then you're going to come home and you're going to start getting on your partner's case about, well, why aren't the dishes put away? And why are the shoes still at the door? And why, right? Like you start nitpicking on this shit that just doesn't matter because you need to get that sense of control back. And I see this often with partnerships where the one partner who tends to want to control things more, they have very particular ways that things need to be done. So if you're going to make dinner, you can't just make dinner. It has to be made like this. And if you're going to clean the kitchen after I make dinner, you can't just clean the kitchen this way. You have to clean it immaculately, the same way that I would. And so what happens is over time, the other partner is trying, right? They may be trying to cook dinner, or they may be trying to clean the kitchen, but every time they do it, they're told that they're doing it wrong. And
Oh
so
yeah.
eventually they give up.
Oh yeah.
Like,
The
what?
media is like, fine, you do it, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then welcome more resentment because the partner who's in control is like, see, I really am doing everything. And it's like, well, but you're not really leaving any room for your partner to try because everything that they do, they get it wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's one where again, and I think that part of that too is that like finding that even for the other, yeah, where I think it's knowing one of the things I think that's interesting. Maybe I'll say it this way. So I think knowing your partner's limiting beliefs is a really valuable thing in that too, right? Where I think that there's an exercise that the Gottmans sort of developed called the aftermath of a regrettable incident, right? And basically the goal of it, so like first off we need to understand both of our perspectives, and we need to feel understood and listened to and validated, and that's important, but immediately after that, what they suggest doing is saying, okay, now think about how you felt in that situation. What did you need? What were you trying to accomplish in that? Now, what happened in your, and it sounds very like Freudian when we say it this way, right? But
Yeah.
tell me about something that happened when you were a child or earlier on in life that you felt like that. How did you learn to feel that way? And right, like what are some of these early memories, or these early, as you were developed, as these limiting beliefs were sort of like programmed into you, so to speak, right? Like what were some of those, and were any of those feelings coming up for you in this? Like, in other words, like, help me understand why you're so sensitive about this in the first place. Because then when you know that, then you don't have to take it personally next time, right?
Yep.
Then the two of you have this mutual understanding of, oh, this is a sensitive thing for her or for him, and I want to be sensitive to that. I want to be understanding and compassionate. And so understanding each other, then we can say, okay, well, what would be helpful for you next time? Or how do we call each other on this a little bit? How do we like send this signal of, again, that maybe that our limiting beliefs aren't clashing with each other so much, and that we can just both sort of help keep each other in check as we're working through this as well. So.
Yeah, I think that makes me think of a limiting belief. We talked a little bit about it at the beginning, but to come back to it, the one, we've all, I'm sure, have experiences as kids where we felt rejected, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or unwanted. We weren't invited to the party or whatever. And if that happens enough, you will internalize those beliefs around I'm unwanted, or I'm going to be abandoned or rejected. And in relationships, that can be very challenging for our partners, because we can do a number of things where if we feel at all we're hypersensitive or hyper aware of any sign that our partner might be pulling away. So
Mm-hmm.
if, again, it comes back to like, if my partner's having a bad day, then I might take that as this whole body alarm goes off of they're going to leave me. So then you either retreat or you go to hurt them first. I'm going to hurt you
Mm-hmm.
before you hurt me. Or we do testing behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where our partner is getting set up to take a test that they don't even know that they're taking. So of course
Yeah.
they're going to fail it, right? So it's like, you know, maybe they come home at the end of the day and you'll say something like, oh, well, you know, you went out for lunch today and you didn't invite me to join.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't you invite me? And it's like, they didn't know that you wanted them to, right? So you don't ask for what you want, because you're just taking every opportunity or many opportunities as a point where your partner can prove to you that they want you. And
Mm-hmm.
that's tricky for a partner to be around, right? Like to always have to be proving that you want
where
them.
it's where the just like where everything just feels like, oh no, I'm not angry, I just need to go lay down, like I just need to go and lay down, like I'm feeling stressed, I need to go unwind for like 15 minutes, like it's nothing personal. That can be very, very frustrating, and if gone unchecked, it ends up kind of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Yeah.
I think a similar kind of thing too is to what you're saying is that often there's this like, are you mad at me, or are you okay, like are you mad, like, and just this constant like need to check in. And I've had where that sort of constant checking in of like, are you mad at me or not, or whatever.
Yeah.
This immediate like, well, now I am, like I'm not, like, right, like this sort of
Yes.
it's goes unchecked until finally there's this like, well, now I'm mad at you because no, if I'm mad, then I'll tell you. And again, there's like the other person doesn't have that need to sort of like always be accepted or be, you know, and so
Yeah.
anyways, so it's much more about like, if you're mad at each other, it's okay to tell that, you don't have to fight about it, but just sort of say, hey, I'm kind of frustrated that you did that, or whatever.
Yes.
And it's okay to do that.
Totally. And I think of like, you know, the way that you can tell for yourself if it's maybe a limiting belief happening is like your reaction is way bigger than what the situation calls for, or there's often a discrepancy between what I rationally know to be true and what I'm emotionally feeling, because often in that moment, you're not actually reacting to your partner who's in front of you. You're reacting to all this past shit that's coming up, and your body's like, this feels familiar. I don't like this. So you see that in like, you know, we'll see couples where it's like, or even an individual where they're saying like, oh my gosh, like I have been cheated on so many times in the past, and now I'm with this person and they're so great and they treat me so well, and yet I am so irrationally jealous. Like I am wanting to check their phones anytime they even look at another girl. I'm like enraged, or I'm accusing them, and I know that they haven't done anything. I know they haven't, you know, that I can trust them, but I can't shake this. And that's where, you know, well, it's probably some of your own, I can't trust, I'm unwanted, I'm going to be abandoned, like whatever it is that's flaring up in those moments. And that's where individual work could be really helpful.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with that. Yeah. And that's where, and a lot of times I'll just sort of like, just sort of describe it as, there's a lot of times in a moment like that, there's even sometimes that there's like that little voice in the back of your head saying like, what are you doing? Like, stop this. Like, this is, you're acting like a crazy person, or like, you know, all of those kinds of things too. And I think that's a pretty good sign that that's a limiting belief. I'll often say just like, well, logically, I know this isn't true, but it sure feels true. So, yeah, absolutely.
Or those moments where like the words are coming out of your mouth, and as they're coming out, you wish you could grab them and stuff them back in.
Yeah.
You're like, no, I don't want to be saying this, but I'm saying it, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, it's making me, I'm remembering something that I'll say to clients sometimes, kind of back to that initial point of, you know, in a situation like that, is it individual therapy or is it couples therapy? Like what needs to happen? And sometimes I think of it as like, you know, say things aren't going well in your relationship and one of you goes to individual therapy. Well, sometimes that could be like going, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to learn dance lessons. I'm going to take weeks of two-stepping lessons because my partner wants more time with me and it would be a great thing for us to do. And you go and you become this really good two-stepper. And then you go to your partner and your partner's like, well, I don't want a two-step. I want a waltz. Or like, I don't even like dancing, right? So sometimes you need to have your partner along that journey too, whether it's them doing their own individual work or it's in couples therapy together where you can both be learning the same dance.
Absolutely.
Right? So that it's like, yeah, it's like, okay, so maybe it's she needs to do the work to not feel like he's going to cheat on her, but then they need to do some couples work together where he can learn, hey, these are going to be the things that you're going to do that are more likely to set that off, or here's what she needs, and all of that to tweak both pieces of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's absolutely. I would totally agree with that. Well, and I think that's sort of a good framework too, right? Like you said, of just being on the same page and being able to work through that together it's I guess my thing that I would say with it too is that often what I would say is that it's important to catch this early, right? That so often this kind of thing goes unchecked for so long, and then it feels like, okay, well, you needed to deal with this stuff, like this limiting belief has gone unchecked for so long that we're not even at a place right now where the two of you are even like, we totally need to do our own stuff and work on things ourselves, because there's so much resentment that I don't even want to think about having to be triggered constantly by you and your stuff too. Right. Yep. And so, I whenever couples come in and it's like, well, I mean, I don't know, we're just here because like sometimes we fight about stuff, or sometimes we there's some issues. I'm like, oh, thank you. Like, yeah. Like, thank you for coming now instead of 10 years from now, because like that is like we've prevented all sorts of disaster and heartache and just like stress and frustration, because it's just a couple of little tweaks that we're going to take care of now, instead of, well, because the longer that these limiting beliefs go unchecked too in your relationship, the more you're reinforcing them, right?
Oh, for sure.
You're right. You're strengthening those limiting beliefs because you're looking for them and you're collecting more and more evidence that they're true in the first place. So maybe that's a little bit of a pessimistic note to end on.
I think the point is yeah, if you can catch it earlier, that's great. If you can't, I don't think you're hopeless. I think that you both can make those change. Like if you're both doing your own individual stuff, then you can come together and make those tweaks. You're golden. I think an even greater option that can be really powerful is if someone comes in when they're still single, because then you can get rid of that unworthy belief that makes you pick the person who needs saving, or you can get rid of that that one where you don't want to show weakness, so nobody can get close to you, so they end anyways, right? Or that one where you feel powerless if somebody asks something for you that you don't necessarily want to do, and then you cut and run. Like, you get rid of that belief, then you're more able to stay with someone and compromise. Like, the doing this work while you're single can be transformative in terms of what types of partners you select, which are then way better suited to you, right? So because I think we don't even necessarily realize that sometimes we are choosing partners not necessarily because they perfectly meet our needs, but maybe because we think they're way out of our league, and so it'll make me look even better if I'm with this super hot person, not even asking like, do we share the same value set, or like, do I even enjoy this person's company? I just like the optics of it,
or even things like, do they respect me? Right? Like even those don't, like even those go out the window when limiting beliefs are in play.
Yes. And so I think I think we would both say that we've seen amazing things come for people when they do their own individual work, whether they're single, in an unhappy relationship, or in a happy relationship, that everything gets better when you address your own shit.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And sometimes that means that when you go and do your own individual work as well, sometimes there's this moment of, oh, you know what? The best thing is actually not to be in this relationship at all. And that's okay. Like that is like that realization, while it may lead to a transition that is very painful, it's also like a new chapter in life that is just like the best thing in the world. So,
yeah.
And it leads to places that are just full of opportunity. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, Lindsay, any final thoughts? I feel pretty good about this episode. I feel like we've covered a lot of awesome stuff.
Yeah, I think so too. I think just, people take a second when the next time you want to snap at your partner for something, maybe sit with it and ask yourself like, hey, might this be some of my own shit that's coming up? And, see where it takes you.
Check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Shift Show. Be sure to check out our website, shiftpsych.com, for more great content to help you optimize your life. Follow us on social media at ShiftPsych, and let us know if you have ideas or things you'd really like to hear about on the podcast. If you found this useful or interesting, which you probably did since you're still here, please share and review the show. And make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. This lets us know that you like what you hear so we can bring you more of it. The podcast was brought to you by ShiftPsych's results-driven mind trainers. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Shift Show.